Defund the Police / Prison Abolition Special Panel, Brock University, Women and Gender Studies 2Q96, Group Project.
Throughout this presentation, we will be investigating the scope of people to whom policing affects. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to have a little bit of insight or understanding as to why there is a demand for the dismantling and complete restructuring of the policing and penal system. This presentation is brought to you by Aaliyah, Alycia, Natalie, Abby, and Jonathan.
Every year, $16.5 billion is given to fund police services in Canada. In one day, $45 million of taxpayers' money will be used to fund police services. Within this presentation, we will be engaging in historical and contemporary discourses related to defunding the police, the necessary steps needed to reallocate funding, and where to distribute such funding. Topics we will discuss are history of policing, societal implications, homelessness, prison systems, women's autonomy in policing, and criminalization of Indigenous women and persons. Policing through a historical context. Prior to colonization, Indigenous peoples used a holistic approach to legal systems. In doing this was by peacemaking and a needs-based approach. After colonialism, the Europeans introduced modern policing. This was around the 1800s. And quote, the stated purpose of the police, the effect was criminalization of the poor, the working class, and certain minority groups. The later criminalization of previously acceptable behaviors, such as profanity or loitering, magnified these effects. End quote. This approach was classist and targeted the poor and visible minorities. Policing as a contemporary product of colonialism.
When we take a look at the contemporary effects of policing and the people it targets, it is important to understand that it is very intentional, often mirroring the violent and abhorrent acts of its forefathers. In other words, remnants of policing's history not only run through, but structure its contemporary foundation and practices. This is what is meant by time being nonlinear. It is through contemporary means that policing is able to continue its oppressive legacy. This is what prompts the question, is there interconnections between past and present? I think a good way to set up the answer to this question is to look at the image on the right. This photo illustrates a flyer that circulated around 1851, cautioning colored people, especially slaves, to steer clear of agents of the government due to threat of kidnapping. The poster reads as follows: Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. This was from April 24th, 1851. Just as a quick note, Aaliyah covered slide 7, the previous slide, and will be presenting until slide 10. Based on the imagery discussed within the previous slide, it becomes evidently apparent that the history of policing, especially contemporary policing, was birthed from the systemic enslavement of people. Slave patrols were enacted, quote, because the white majority was so concerned about slave revolts, of which there were many, and runaway slaves, they created this new form of law enforcement, end quote. Mercado, 2020, page 115. So often when discourse is brought to light surrounding slave patrols and their ties to policing, it is, quote, relegated to a mere adjunct in the history of police, end quote. Bricado 2020, page 116. Rather than an influential factor which has set the tone for policing practices across decades. This could be one of many examples to which perpetuate colonial unknowing, where there is a lack of acknowledgement for the colonial and anti-Black rhetoric and acts which have stained the legacy of policing. It is also important to note that because these slave patrols were so connected to slave labor, which laid the groundwork for capitalism, there seems to be deep interconnections between the commodification of Black bodies, policing, and capitalism. Now, while much of this information is framed in an American context or lens, I think it would be naive to assume that this had no effect on early Canadian policing practices. For too long, Canada has attempted to establish a dichotomy between itself and the States, when in reality we share many similarities, including but not limited to geography, histories, and social conventions. These are just some things that I'd like for you to keep in mind and contemplate. Let us consider the notion of, quote, the afterlife of slavery, a term coined by Saidiya Hartman, as manifested in a continuous perception and treatment of Black people simultaneously as property/labor to be exploited and as a potential threat to be closely monitored, subjugated, and contained, end quote. Regima 2019, page 251. Now let's move to societal implications. Now let's take a look at how policing can enact social implications. One of the most important questions we can ask is how the institution of policing has fostered an environment which encourages attitudes of surveillance and control amongst one another in society, that being outside of the institution of policing itself. One prominent example that comes to mind is the caricature of the Karen. Now, while this term became prominent throughout the 2020 protests, I think we should delve into what this caricature actually represents. In my mind, she embodies a civilian outside of the institution of policing who thinks she has the authority and power to police and surveil others, usually those who exist on the margins of society or those who stray from that which is societally conventional. Because the institution of policing has incessantly targeted marginalized communities, it has set an example for others, which emboldens them to take matters, quote, into their own hands. This is exactly what a Karen represents. She is a contemporary archetype that works to perpetuate heightened notions of surveillance and control while holding onto white colonial ideology. Now, one may quickly ask, how does this involve racial tensions? If we look a little deeper, you begin to understand that she, being the Karen, is asserting her sense of white privilege. She is able to utilize her whiteness and womanhood to weave in and out of victimhood to get what she wants. This is where we can see interconnections between whiteness and power, which ultimately gives these Karens the gall or audacity to surveil others. Like I said, this attitude is a product of policing and the way in which it is valued within society. We have gotten to a point where we control and surveil the bodies, choices, and free will of others, usually based on their place within societal hierarchies, to which the institution of policing has encouraged or set in motion. We have gone from policing being somewhat distinct from society to it influencing the attitudes and beliefs of everyday people. Another example of this attitude is exemplified in the policing of women's bodies, the policing or surveilling of the ways in which people can take up space and exist, especially if they do not fit into white patriarchal societies. So that could include trans people, bodies in general, racialized people, disabled people, gender nonconforming people, and everyone in between. This attitude of surveilling and control has even traversed into realms of education, where they are controlling and policing what can and can't be taught. So, therefore, restricting books, restricting sex ed, restricting teaching around racism and critical race theory. What we need to understand is that the carceral system manifests itself in many different ways. It is not only subject to physical apparatuses, but mental ones as well. When we internalize policing and prison practices, we internalize a mindset which upholds displacement, violence, and marginalization. We need to start recognizing, quote, recognizing the spatial proximity of the community to the prison, end quote. Jones, 2022, page 32. Whether in mind or physicality, we are closer to the carceral system than we think. The next section is evaluating policing through homelessness. This will be covered by Alycia.
There is a negative connotation associated with the term homeless. And what I mean by that, it is used as a single identity marker, and this neglects to understand the intersectional beings who live and experience homelessness. There's a lack of funding for this population of folks. And I quote, "The Government of Canada has committed nearly $3 billion over 9 years to address homelessness. In addition, $567 million in additional investments over 2 years, beginning in 2022 to 23." End quote. Looking further into funding for police services, there is $16.5 billion a year allocated to funding police services, equaling out to $45 million a day. It is important to reflect on this funding, as we can reallocate a portion of this to support the House's population. Taking a look at BIPOC stats, Black folk are about 3.5 times more likely to be without housing than the rest of the population, and Indigenous folk are 30 times more likely to experience homelessness in Toronto. Indigenous folk are also about 70 times as likely to be sleeping in encampments and report higher rates of police harassment. These intersectional folks experience mass amounts of oppression being houseless, but also BIPOC folks have higher chances of experiencing homelessness next to their white counterfolk. As stated in Abolitionist Intimacies, and I quote, "Canada as a settler colonial state is inherently part of this, as containment, removal, and collection processes are tied to Canada's historical and genocide of Indigenous folk." End quote. Relating back to the core themes of colonial knowing, bodily integrity, and structural violence, these are all relevant to this topic and argument of defunding the police and reallocating funding to the homeless population. We are left with the question of, where should we reallocate this funding? Some resourceful and anti-oppressive resources would be peer support workers, folks with lived experience who can genuinely connect with the homeless folk, 24/7 street outreach workers, implementation of new policies. For example, 60% of taser use was inflicted on those experiencing mental health crises, and that needs to be addressed. Affordable housing and supportive housing, intensive case management support, and gender-based violence programming. It is important to touch on the topic of social determinants of health. Shelter is a basic fundamental right for human beings, and access to safe shelter should be available for all, regardless of social location and presenting health issues. In Niagara Region, the 2021 point-in-time count for homeless individuals was calculated at 665. Out of those 665 individuals, 61% identified a self-reported mental health issue that was being a probable cause to them experiencing homelessness. 40% identified a substance use related issue being a probable cause to homelessness as well. These stats provided mental health and addiction support should be readily available for access, regardless of social status. But it is important to understand social determinants of health specific to the House's population. These include housing, income, transportation, and access to medical services. With these listed, the homeless population do not have those fundamental basic human rights met, and therefore create major health inequalities. And I quote, "Until a healthcare problem becomes life-threatening, a homeless individual will likely choose shelter or food before going to the doctor. These priorities must be considered when dealing with the homeless population. What might at first seem like carelessness or noncompliance is simply, in reality, a struggle to survive." End quote. This is when intersectionality should be considered. Understanding the systems of inequality intersect, thus creating unique dynamics and effects. The justice system is overzealous in ways that harms the homeless population, especially BIPOC, queer, and trans folk. It is important to consider reallocating this funding from police services to mental health services, housing, and affordable housing, so we can support our homeless folk, not further oppress them. There are intersections within individuals who experience homelessness. They endure mass amounts of oppression solely based off their social location, and on top of that, police brutality and dehumanization. And that ends my argument of why we should reallocate funding to support the homeless folk.
This section is evaluating policing through prison systems. This particular section is going to be covered by Jonathan.
To understand the historical link between policing and prisons, I'll discuss some of the Canadian background. So today it includes correction centers, child protection, and mandatory mental health facilities. And the missionaries of the 1600s and Canada's residential school system is a highly important precedent. And in countries like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the First Nations individuals are disproportionately incarcerated and mistreated under prison systems. So that's a very important underlying theme through all of this. And so one of the first forms of imprisonment in Canada dates back to the 1600s, when the British colonizers established jails to detain the Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities. The settlers believed that their faith was the inherent superior way to life, and they worked to assimilate the First Nations outsiders. Yet these early jails were harsh and punitive, designed to punish rather than rehabilitate individuals. Then in the 1800s, the penitentiary system was introduced, which was modeled after American and European systems. The Kingston Penitentiary was established in 1835, and it was one of the earliest and most significant institutions in this system. It aimed to reform individuals through religious and moral instructions, hard labor, and solitary confinement. Throughout the 20th century, the prison system underwent significant changes, which were influenced by various social and political movements, such as like in the 1960s and 70s, we saw an increase in prison populations due to the tough on crime policies and the mandatory minimum sentence. During this period, there was a shift towards a more punitive approach with an emphasis on retribution rather than rehabilitation. In the 1980s, the Canadian government introduced the concept of corrections, emphasizing the importance of rehabilitation and community reintegration. However, this approach was short-lived, as in the 1990s we saw a return to those tough-on-crime policies, resulting in a further increase in the prison populations and harsher sentencing. Yet in recent years, there has been a growing movement towards prison abolition and transformative justice in Canada. The government has introduced measures to reduce prison populations, including the use of alternatives to incarceration, such as restorative justice and community-based programs. However, significant challenges remain in the Canadian prison system. The Indigenous individuals and other marginalized communities are still disproportionately represented, highlighting the ongoing impact of the systemic racism and discrimination. There are also concerns about the use of solitary confinement, as well as inadequate mental health support and insufficient funding for education and vocational training programs. Of course, these unfair punishments are, go figure, experienced mostly by those who are forced to live on the street as a result of this discrimination, where their survival methods are restricted or done so by bylaws, living in areas highly patrolled by police and with no aspect of privacy. In Canada, there are already movements towards prison abolition. The Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project is working towards ending the use of prisons and advocating for alternatives, The Rethinking Prisons project in British Columbia is also advocating for a transformative approach to justice. Prison system reforms have proven unsuccessful, so a new system would have to be ready before completely abolishing the prison system. Abolishing the prison system is a radical solution, yet it is a necessary one. We must redirect resources from the prison industrial complex to social services that address the root causes of crime. This approach involves acknowledging that poverty, mental health issues, addiction, and other societal problems lead to criminal behavior. So, what would a society without prisons look like? It would prioritize restorative justice and community-based solutions. Instead of punishing individuals for their crimes, we would work to repair the harm they caused and prevent further harm from occurring. This approach requires community involvement and engagement, as well as an emphasis on education, social services, and mental health support. Some may argue that we need prison systems to protect society from dangerous individuals. However, studies show that incarceration does not lead to reduced crime rates. In fact, communities that invest in social services and preventative measures actually see a decrease in crime rates. As Angela Davis said, "We can't imagine a world without prisons, but today more people understand that you cannot incarcerate away racism. You can't incarcerate poverty. You can't incarcerate any social problem."
Evaluating policing through the lens of women's bodily autonomy. This particular section will be covered by Natalie.
Conversations around racism are commonly centered around men. Women of color do find themselves in a unique position as they not only contend with racism but also gender-based violence. Women of color are more likely to be profiled by police and segregated in other institutions. This can be seen in schools with expulsion rates of young black girls being much higher than young white girls, abuse from police officers, and in undue arrests and killings of black women. It can be understood that slavery entailed extreme exploitation and abuse of black people, which has had a lasting impact through generations. Female slaves not only had to exert forced labor, but also had to contend with sexual expectation. This may have come in the form of how they look or what was expected of them in their duties. This subjected them to unique forms of harassment, and while this cannot be changed, it is vital that we actively look to understand histories and vulnerability as a result of various identities. Around the world, it is being enforced that women do not have autonomy over their bodies. This can be seen in countless cases of police brutality in the US for women of color. This can be seen in Iran with the police attacks that have been going on, and it can be seen in indirect acts of violence such as the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the United States. Regardless, women are facing oppression on all ends and need to actively try to fight against it. Say Her Name brings attention to the stories of women when they have been stripped of their bodily integrity as a way of reclaiming it.
Evaluating policing as it pertains to racist practices and the criminalization of Indigenous peoples. This particular section will be covered by Abby.
We, Indigenous peoples, are the first inhabitants of the land. Now that it is occupied, we must be exterminated. We mean more to the nation dead than alive. To begin, I've added this quote from Women and Gender Studies professor Dr. Robin Bourgeois because it sets a tone of intentionality. Since Turtle Island was colonized, the Canadian government has had one goal in mind: to displace Indigenous peoples from their land and to eradicate their culture. The police force and prison system are continuously weaponized against First Nations peoples to keep them at the margins of the land that was stolen from them. The implications of residential schools. In order to understand the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian prison system, we must recognize the lasting effects of the residential school system. Children stolen and placed in residential schools have traumatic childhoods filled with physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Many survivors then turn to substances such as drugs and alcohol to escape the horrors experienced during their imprisonment. Many suffer from PTSD and rely on these things as coping mechanisms. Reliance on substances can then lead to trouble within the law. Many Indigenous offenders are arrested for non-violent crimes such as public intoxication. Factors like sentencing, racial profiling, and police discretion in their treatment of nonviolent Indigenous offenders all contribute to their representation in the prison system, and this will be discussed in the next few slides. Abuse endured in residential schools can also create a cycle of abuse within the family of survivors, for example, perpetrated against their future children or a future partner, which can leave them with lasting trauma and potential issues coping with substances. It's also to be said that a lot of Indigenous women and girls who face violence in larger cities, such as the downtown east side in Vancouver, have fled from abuse that they were facing in their home community. The residential school system also created a cycle of poverty through displacement from land, community, and culture. Schools were often located many miles from the homes of stolen children, so if they did make it out, they were left in an unfamiliar area without means or a network of support. This cycle of poverty can lead to poverty-related crimes such as shoplifting for food and other items related to survival. Indigenous peoples from all sectors are targeted disproportionately for police violence, but Indigenous women are exceptionally vulnerable to sexual violence at the hands of the police due to sexism, misogyny, and their dehumanization through colonial stereotypes such as the squaw. Many view Indigenous women as promiscuous, readily available, and incapable of being assaulted because they are asking for it or welcome it. Indigenous sex workers are especially vulnerable to predation justified by these stereotypes because of their line of work. In a report titled Submission to the Government of Canada, Police Abuse of Women in Saskatchewan, Indigenous women account their experiences of sexual violence at the hands of the police. Multiple women report being brought into the station for public intoxication and were stripped of their clothing and left in a cell overnight. Officers claim that their undergarments had to be withheld because they could be used for hanging. Although the removal of undergarments is upheld by the Supreme Court as an accepted method of strip search, there is no reason why the women needed to be left overnight for long periods of time without their clothing other than their humiliation and degradation. Demands for strip searches to be performed by a female officer are regularly ignored despite the presence of a female officer on shift. During searches, several women have had their breasts and genitals groped by an officer or have been verbally harassed. These stories mirror the conditions faced by young girls in detention centers as well. In a report titled Youth Focus, Indigenous girls describe the violent and gendered condition faced in their youth detention center. The girls are held in a co-ed facility, leaving them vulnerable to violence from male prisoners and guards. They are often subject to examination of their breasts and genitals during exams that are supposed to be assessing their psychological welfare. These reports all go to show the ways that the police abuse their position of power to assault Indigenous women and girls without consequence, and in instances where aid may be required, such as those with substance use or mental health issues, how their treatment does not benefit or intend to reform the individual. The funding provided to police would be better suited in rehab and detox programs, as well as dispatch services ran by mental health professionals and responders that do not resort to physical and sexual violence. Aside from the sexual violence that terrorizes Indigenous women and girls, Indigenous peoples are the target of racial profiling from police. Indigenous peoples are often subject to random street stops where they may be asked where they are going, what they are doing, and asked for a piece of identification. Often they are not given a reason as to why they are being stopped, or if they are given one, it is because they fit a description, which is them being Indigenous. And if they refuse to cooperate or ask why they are being questioned, they are met with disproportionate violence and detention. Indigenous peoples are also too often the victims of excessive force, such as tasering and physical violence, for not cooperating with law enforcement. In real terms, they know their rights and ask and question the intentions and the actions of the officers. They are also targeted disproportionately for minor offenses such as jaywalking, shoplifting, and loitering in comparison to other races. These small charges can snowball into much larger sentences and convictions depending on the conditions of bail and whether or not there are breaches, and these individuals can end up spending a lot longer time in detention for a smaller crime because they were given unrealistic expectations for bail. It is far too often that Indigenous offenders are denied bail due to the assumption that they are a flight risk. This can be detrimental to their sentencing because, quote, people held in pre-trial detention are twice as likely to plead guilty as those who are out on bail, unquote. If bail is granted, it usually comes with a set of unrealistic regulations that ignore circumstances such as homelessness due to poverty and loss of land, lack of transportation, and for youth, the fact that they may reside in a group or foster home and are unable to move around and about freely. For those experiencing homelessness that are let out on bail, it is easy to miss court appearances because their living situation makes it difficult to receive summons. This, in turn, leads to further negative consequences that can also affect their sentencing. The Glade Guideline or Reform is in place to ensure that in sentencing, judges acknowledge the cultural and societal factors such as systematic racism, residential schools, and the Indian Act that may be relevant in an offender's circumstance that led them to commit a crime. Judges continue to ignore Glade in the prairie states, or provinces, where they are arguably most needed, and some judges even refuse to acknowledge defendants as Indigenous to get around this provision. Ignorance regarding culturally significant factors and practices is also demonstrated in the eradication of Indigenous culture in the prison system. Examples of this are included on the next slide.
Now, this section will focus on prevalent intersections and common struggles, which will not only span across themes discussed within this presentation, but overall themes discussed throughout the course. As we've traversed through this journey of activism, it's important to reflect on the prevalent interconnections. We've discussed notions of colonial unknowing, bodily autonomy or integrity, and institutional or systemic violence, which all seem to either be closely related or dependent on one another. At the beginning of the presentation, we discussed who policing affects, and the answer is everybody. Not only does it directly inflict its wrath, but it forces or trains others, specifically civilians, to do its dirty work. So, because policing affects a multitude of groups, there should be more of a push to dismantle the systems to which it operates through. Since a large portion of this course is dedicated to exploring the ways in which art and activism are intimately connected, this section will center around various art and its ability to express the importance of police reform or abolishment.